the first assignment in this class, I like to at least spend a little time pretending that we're still working with film, specifically black and white film, and that I'm going to be asking you while looking through the lens to be thinking ahead in terms of black and white. And then in GIMP or in Photoshop, because Photoshop's really where it all began, we're going to look at the digital tools that mimic what was done in the darkroom, or what is done. It's not as if there are no darkrooms left. They're just not as prevalent as they used to be. All right, so in the you'll recall in the lecture on the early history of photography, we talked about how the enlarger works in the darkroom, right? You have a strip of film, goes into this film carrier, goes into this thing. The enlarger has a bulb in here that shines a light down onto your photographic paper down here. Right? Well, it's not as if it just ends there. It's not as if you snap your picture, now you stick the negative in here, and you just push a button and bam, you're going to have a perfect image. There are so many things to play around with. For one, how long should the light shine down through this thing, through this negative onto your photo paper? And what level of contrast, brightness or darkness do you want? And how do we manipulate those things? So again, in the darkroom, here's a photograph over here of someone using an enlarger. Right? They don't have their photographic paper down there just yet. They're just trying to get the image lined up for when they do put the paper in there. And each enlarger would be attached to a timer. And going through a process that there's no need for us to try to talk about right now, you would sort of figure out what's going to get what amount of time with the light coming through this enlarger, through the lens of the enlarger onto your paper, is going to give you the exposure that you want, where the image looks the way you want it. And then you would put your photographic paper in, you'd set your timer for that amount of time. And then just like we talked about in the lecture, you'd put your photos through all the chemicals to develop it. If I could see, it's so dark in here. But we can also play around with the amount of contrast that we have. So in the darkroom, that was done by these filters. I've got a set of these at home. Actually, I've got a set of them in my office. If you ever wanted to check it out, I've got a little black box. I can open it up and show you. These things, right? They've got numbers that the numbers correspond to an amount of contrast. They slide in just below the negative, so that when the light's shining through the negative, it then shines through a filter. And as you can see, some of them are kind of yellowish, some of them are red, some of them are purple, right? And that the photographic paper has different sensitivities to those different kinds of light. What they say is a perfect 50-50, right down the middle kind of contrast is a 2.5, meaning that negative should look pretty much exactly the way it would look normally. Then if you want less contrast, meaning you don't want a lot of super bright whites and you don't want really dark darks, you start moving that number down from 2.5. If you want really high contrast, so you do want some darker darks and some really bright whites, then you start moving upward in your numbers, up to eventually I think it's a 5.5. Some filters I've seen have a 6, but most of them go up to 5.5. But two things happen. As you go down in contrast, your image becomes more and more gray, but more and more of the detail becomes discernible. As you move up in contrast, sure, you're going to get really nice bright whites and you're going to get really nice dark darks, but you start to lose detail because a lot of that detail starts to go away as you're shifting your colors your values, I should say, to only white and only black eventually. You put a 5.5, and it's going to be very hard to get anything but pure black and pure white on your image. Now, I say all this because this is how that was done in the darkroom, but we have a lot of digital tools that will do the same thing. And it mimics what those would do. So you'll notice when we go to those, is that if you start to crank down your contrast, you're going to see an image that starts turning gray, but lots more detail starts popping out. And move it toward higher contrast, and you get a much more dynamic image, right? Really high contrast images are interesting to look at, but you lose detail. So there's a trade-off, and it's figuring out which one you want depending on what you're interested in making happen. So here's an example so that you can sort of see it happening for yourself. Each of these is a filter that's a step up from the last. So here we're probably looking at like a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5. And notice how this first image is very, very gray. But you've got lots and lots of detail in it. You would probably have the texture of the stones. You've got texture going on the door. Right? There's a lot of detail happening because there's not any color that's super dark and there's not any color that's super white. Keep moving up, and those colors, I keep saying colors, values, begin to separate and become more contrasty. They start moving more and more toward eventually, once we get to this 5 filter here, almost pure black and pure white, with maybe some grays in between, but not a lot, right? Now that image is a lot more interesting. It's eye-catching because it instantly reads very well to us. It doesn't sort of feel like it's fading into a background too much. But where this has a whole lot more detail happening in that bush, a lot more happening in the texture of the rocks, you get over here, and that's been crushed down to almost pure black in areas down in here. The stone doesn't have nearly as much texture as I can see here. I can see a lot more. It may be harder to see if they're on the screen, but on my screen, I can see a lot more of like the individual wood grain in this door. And here, it's kind of mostly gray, and then these really bright areas where the paint has sort of been scraped away, and that's about it. All right, so when you're working in black and white, you think about those kinds of trade-offs. Do I want more contrast but less detail, or really low contrast and lots of detail, or do I want high contrast but little detail? Then there's this thing called burning and dodging. And if you're taking notes, and make a note of this, because burning and dodging become important. These slides are available to you on Google Classroom too, though. Because every now and then, you'll have gotten the contrast of the overall photograph exactly the way you want it, but there's some area in the photo that's still a little too bright or a little too dark. But it's just that one little area that's bugging you. And that's where dodging and burning come in. We're going to talk about first how it was done in the darkroom, and then when we play around with GIMP, we'll look at how it's done now. So first off is dodging. Dodging is when you have an area of the exposure in your photograph that's too dark. So dodging decreases the amount of light that the paper gets exposed to in a specific area, which makes that area lighter, which is counterintuitive, but remember that we're working with a negative, right? So in that negative, all the places that need to be black are clear, so the light shines straight through. Because as light hits the paper, that's the part that's going to darken. So you'll have an object. It's usually like this. It's usually kind of lollipop shaped, that you hold over the portion of your photograph that you want to be lightened, and then you make your exposure to it. And since you're getting less light in that area, you're going to get a brighter image. But the lollipop allows you to just dodge a particular area for a particular amount of time. Then we have what's called burning. Burning is when you have an area of the photograph that needs to be a little darker. So you expose that area to more light. So you give a little extra exposure by using, normally it's like this, it'll be a piece of black light-tight cardboard with a hole in it that allows a little extra light to get on the portion that you want to burn, as it's called. It's called burning because you're making it darker. You're exposing it to more light. So let's say you discovered in the darkroom that you got exactly the right kind of contrast, exactly the kind of image that you wanted by having a 3.5 filter in there, and you expose your paper for like 30 seconds. But there's this one little area that's too bright. You want to darken it. You want to get some more detail into that area. So maybe you expose the entire thing for 30 seconds. Then you set your timer for like 5 more seconds. Then you put that piece of cardboard out there with that hole over the exact spot where you need to have a little more light. Turn on that enlarger for those 5 extra seconds, and then you kind of shake that cardboard so that you don't have a perfect like circle that's darker than everything else. By shaking it, you kind of feather your edges out. In GIMP and in Photoshop, there is a burn and dodge tool. And the icon for it looks like one of those lollipops that we use for dodging. And it does the exact same thing that this does, only rather than adding extra light to it, it's going to either add a little more black to the colors of each pixel inside the circle that you make, or it's going to add a little more white into each one if you're dodging. So, in dodging, you get that image up there at the top that this person has taken of their breakfast, and they were like, this is how I like the image, right? When I expose my film for this particular amount of time, I like what I get, except it's just too dark in there. But I don't want to expose it for less time, because then I might have this yolk of the egg that's too bright. Right? So what do we do? Well, we could go in here and dodge a little bit in the portions underneath the egg, and as such, you brighten it a bit, and it finds some of that detail that was missing here because this was so dark. Right? Notice how we can see a lot more of this stuff. That's a matter of dodging that area right there. Right? They would have come in and dodged in these little places with a lollipop, just to not get as much of exposure in those places. Then when would it be a time for burning? Well, this person had this photograph right here, and it seems like they had a couple of things they were concerned about. They felt like these numbers, because this light was shining right here, the numbers weren't standing out strongly enough. And it looks like they kind of wanted a better contrast between the front of the plane and the sky here. Although you can't tell it as much up there, but I assure you that they're doing this. I'll talk about it in a second. So right here, in their exposure, they burned these areas of the numbers to get them just a little darker here, so that those numbers stand out better from the metal. And up here, although it's not as easy to tell on the screen up there, you can tell it on mine, they went in and burned this front portion of this dark part right here, so that this stands out much nicer from the sky. Up there, they look about the same, but on my screen, this is lighter. And it looks like they came in and just burned this just a little bit because they wanted it to stand out a bit more there. It looks like they also burned inside here. Can you tell up there? Not really. On my screen, this part right here is a little more gray, and they've gone in and burned it over here so that it's much darker to kind of make it stand out much more sharply from this. But at the very least, you can see it in the numbers, right? They are darker on this side than they are over here. Then, another cool thing about the darkroom is that there are different types of paper that gave you a different look to the images. And we're going to talk about ways to mimic that in GIMP as well. Because there was like the standard gelatin silver. I keep saying was. These things still exist and people still use them. It's just that it used to be this was all you had. We didn't have digital for so long. So you have like a typical silver gelatin, pure black, pure white, not much in the way of any kind of tone. Then we have a sepia, or sometimes we refer to as warm tone, and then cool tone. The sepia or warm tone gives you some nice chocolatey browns instead of pure blacks. And your cool tone gives you kind of some purpley blues instead of pure black. You can see it happening over here in these three images as well. Right, where this person has printed the exact same image but on 3 different types of paper, and making some adjustments to the contrast and things of that nature in order to get the different effects that they want in each one. And we'll talk about that some in class as well. So the assignment. Assignment number 1 will be to take one composition that you've taken, one photograph that you have taken, and create 5 different versions of that one composition in black and white, playing around with contrast, playing around with what we call levels. You'll find out what that's about when we get to it. And any burning and dodging that you might need. Now, you can play around with more than one, right? You might decide to play around with like 5 or 6 of them in order to find the one that gives you the perfect 5 images that you would like to upload for the assignment. And then, as it says, using those tools and filters that we're going to cover in the class, you're going to edit that composition in 5 different ways. Now, if you're struggling to get what that looks like, let's look at a few examples. Although it looks horrible up there because the sun's actually starting to shine through the window. Here's one student who took this particular photograph, and this is one way they edited it. Pretty high contrast, right? There's a lot of black, a lot of white, not much in the way of grays in between. Then, wow, that doesn't look very different up there, but I assure you on my screen, there's a bit more gray in that one. And they did some burning and dodging, but again, you can't really tell up there. We'll go to this one then, since this one's a little more grayish in nature. Then they have one here that's in sepia tone. It's just a little hard to tell up there. We can see a little more of the difference between that one and this one, right? Some of the grays in that one. This one, much more high contrast. All right. We have this student. This was, I think, the one they chose as their one that had the perfect image for them. Then we have one here where they pushed it really dark. It's even darker up there because of this room right now. In my view, I've got a little bit more of, there's not really a good pure white, but there are some brighter grays. This one, where they edited the whole thing a bit brighter, is that the sun was just going nuclear. This one they did in cool tone, which you can't really tell up there, but I promise if you look at these on the Google Classroom, you'll see that they've got a lot more bluish colors in this one. And then this one they did in sepia. Maybe you can see the difference if you go between those two. As you can see how that one's much cooler. This one's a much more warm and brownish in nature. You just can't tell as much switching from there to here. All right, and this person taking this photograph of a reflection in a puddle of water of someone walking past. And this one is the one that they felt was the perfect exposure for them. Then they did one where they really cranked the contrast. So there's some really nice darks. And you can see how in playing around with the contrast and things of that nature, you can change the mood of a scene. This one, go back. This one is just a reflection of somebody walking along. It doesn't really feel like much more than that. This one feels foreboding and horror movie-esque almost, right? Here they went the other way and really cranked up the contrast. I'm sorry, the other way around, cranked down the contrast and brightened the whole image. This is one where they just decided to make it into a negative, and I was like, okay, that wasn't part of the assignment, but fine. And then they did one that's cool tone, which it may be a little hard to tell, but I assure you those blacks and grays are in the blue range. All right? All right, so what I want you to do is to find where you may have a photograph that you can play around with on your desktop, on your computer somewhere. And if you've got GIMP downloaded, you should be able to now right-click on an image. And when this drop-down comes, there should be one. If you go down to open, where is it? Open with, right here. Now GIMP should be one of your options out here. Especially if this is the first time you've ever opened GIMP, it's going to go through a bunch of stuff. It needs to access your fonts. It needs to load all of the plugins. So, right now, your photo is, of course, in color. And when you took this photograph, you weren't thinking about black and white. So don't worry if this one doesn't want to work very well in black and white. We just need one to practice on. All right? So the first thing that we got to do is we got to get rid of all this color, because that's just getting in the way. So up here at the very top, you got a band of options. We're going to click on the one called Colors. Makes sense that that's where we go to get rid of the color. And you're going to scroll down here to where it says Desaturate. That opens up the second menu, and we're going to click on Desaturate again. Right? It's going to give us this little dialog that's going to pop up. And you'll see here, like, don't worry about like blending options, right? If you've got preview turned on, that's great. You can see the entire image in the way that's going to change. If you click on split view, it lets you see part of it in color and part of it. You can see the changes you're making. I'm going to turn that off. I just prefer to see the whole thing the way I'd like. And then here it says mode. I can, come on. Why is it being weird? I'm going to have to hold down the button, I guess. All right, it gives me a few options to pick from. All right, if it's on luminance, it takes the luminance of the color, not just whether or not it has black or white mixed into the pixel, each pixel, but the luminance. It takes into account the luminance of the color, right? So yellow is a much brighter color than, say, purple, even though neither color has black or white mixed into it. That's what we refer to as luminance. If I click on Luma, it's going to take in, it's similar to luminance. I'm not going to get into all that. Lightness takes in how much black or white is mixed into an image. Average takes this and the luminance and averages them together. And value just takes into account the hue, the saturation, and the value of each pixel. So if I click on that, I get a completely different image from the luminance. All right, so just click through those until you see one where you're like, yeah, that's the one I would like to play around with. We're going to make more further changes to it. So even if you think it's not completely perfect, it's okay, because we're going to make some more changes. What I'm looking for right now is one where the, oh my God, that looks horrible up there. I'm looking for one where the fish stands out a bit more from the water. That's kind of doing it. Either luminance or value is the way I want to go. I think I'm going to go for luminance. And then hit OK. And you will have a black and white image. All right? So here are our ways of controlling all that stuff we just talked about, where it's going to mimic what we were doing in the darkroom. All right? Again, this is under colors. And there are a few things you can play around with that will do all these different things. The first one we're going to go to is brightness and contrast. Click on that one. And this gives us two little sliders, a brightness slider and a contrast slider. They do exactly what they sound like. If I take the brightness slider and I slide it up, I'm going to make my image brighter and brighter and brighter. It's adding more white to every single pixel. If I take it the other way, it's turning my brightness down. It's adding more and more black to every pixel. Right? I'm going to click reset to take it right back to the middle. Contrast. If I take this up, the slider up, it's going to push every pixel more and more toward pure white or pure black. And if I take it all the way up, I've got nothing but pure black and pure white. If I go the other way, it's going to add a little more gray to each pixel, and it's moving each pixel more and more close to middle gray. And if I go all the way, I've got literally nothing but middle gray on my screen. Right? I'll hit reset. So this could be a thing I could play with. I could say, well, let me brighten the image a bit and then crank the contrast a bit. And maybe I like that image. Or maybe I darken the image and then I crank the contrast down to try to get a little more detail in there at the by sacrificing pure white and pure black. If you ever do anything you don't like, you can always click here on reset and it'll take it right back to the middle. So I'll let you play around with those two sliders for a bit. We're not going to, when we're done, we're just going to hit cancel because I want to show you another tool as well. And I don't want you to have an image that you've already manipulated before we look at that tool. All right, now the cool thing, that's cool because it's simple. They're just two sliders, simple enough. And if this is what you want to use for playing around with that, you certainly can. But I'm going to hit cancel now. There's another tool we can play around with that'll do similar things, but with a lot more finesse because there's more to push around. So if we go back up to colors and then to levels, and you want to make sure right here where it says channel in this new dialog that opened, that it says value. Value is how we refer to darkness and lightness in art. And what you have right here is a graphical representation of all of the values you have in your composition, with pure black all the way over here, pure white all the way over here, middle gray is in the middle, and you'll see those little triangles below it. That represents where middle gray, black, and white are. All right? So right now you see, here's my middle gray. I've got a big, gigantic spike at middle gray. That's because there's a lot of middle gray in my image. It goes down a bit toward white and down a bit toward black because there aren't a whole lot of those colors in here. But I can manipulate that by grabbing these little triangles down here and moving them around. So that I can say, instead of making this area here white, I can click on this slider and I can say, make everything from here to there white. And now there are suddenly some brighter whites in here. And I can do the same with the black. I could say, instead of putting black down here, let's push it up this way. And now everything between there and there is black. And then I can take my middle gray and I can say, well, I want more values between white and middle gray. So let me take this middle gray and push it toward black. And that makes the whole image a bit brighter because now there's all of these values here between white and middle gray. Or I can take that and go the other way with it and make everything much more dark. Because again, I'm saying between black and middle gray, there's all that. Right? I'm going to hit reset. Why are you not resetting? Is it because I got the screen recording thing going? Sometimes my screen recorder and GIMP don't like to get along. So I'm going to try by going to levels. Another thing I can do is you see there's this little dropper, this little button right here that's got a dropper on it, and a little button right here that's got a dropper on it. This allows me to take this. If I click on this, it gives me like what looks like a little dropper tool, like an ink dropper. And I can say, oh, so this is black. And I can say, well, I would like, let me pick something that's not black. I would like to make this person's hat black. Boom. And it's going to make that black and then all the other colors in between. And notice how my black triangle jumped over here. It's hard to see up there, but I promise you it did. And then I can say, well, what I want to be white is maybe this little area right here. And it's going to push everything white that was between this and that value that I clicked on. Okay, reset. Then down here toward the bottom, I have another slider that looks very similar to this one up here with black on one end and white on the other. And there's a black triangle and a white triangle that I can slide around. This is the output levels. Right now, black pixels are set to be black. Makes sense. And white pixels are set to be white. But I can say, you know what? I don't want a pure black in here. Take all of my black and make it that dark gray right there instead. And I don't want any pure white pixels. I want them instead to be that. Sure, right? And so with this thing, reset, I can do what I was doing with those two sliders, but with a whole lot more finesse. Because I could say, let's make my brights brighter. I want it to look like a nice sunny day. But I've got some areas that I'd like to be a little darker than they are. And maybe I want that water to be a bit darker. So I'm going to crank it over. Play around and get this white to stand out a bit more. Until I have an image where what I'm trying to do is maybe get this fish and this guy right here to stand out a bit more from the water. And then let this guy's hair become darker. And I'm getting there. And then I can say, well, maybe I don't want these blacks to be super black. So I'm going to crank them this way. Or vice versa. Maybe I do want those blacks, but maybe I want the whites to not be so harsh. So I chill them out a little bit. And then I can hit OK. And I've got myself an image that I like. Except for some things that I might dodge or burn. All right. Now, I'm going to go up here to File and Undo. I'm sorry, Edit and Undo to get rid of that. So I can show you one more thing that does the same stuff, but in a slightly different way, and it gives you even more finesse, but it's a little more difficult to visualize, but a lot of artists like this. So under colors, a lot of photographers, I should say. Under colors, there's this one called curves. All right, and you still want the channel set to value. Right now, it's going to make the most sense if you get this set to smooth. And it's a little more difficult to visualize, all right? But you have, again, a graph. Man, it's hard to see. Hopefully you can see the graph in yours better than you can on the screen. That showcases the same thing that we were just looking at. Black is over here, white is over here. All right, but there's also left to right, but then there's also what is this? The y-axis? The y is the one that goes up and down, right? I think. No, yes, the y is and then there's an x-axis that goes this way. And then there's this white line that goes at a perfect 45-degree angle because any pixel that is white is lined up with white this way, and it's lined up with white this way. And any pixel that's black is lined up with black here and black here. So that every pixel is exactly the way it should be given what the image looks like. But I can take this line and click on it to make a point. And then I can take that point and start curving this line. And I can make another point and start curving it again. And I can grab in between the points. Come on. And I should be able to bend that line, but it's being weird, not letting me. There we go. All right? And I can make my image the way I would like it to be in this way. Now, that's giving me a really insane photograph. I probably don't want to stretch it to that extent. But that's something you can play around with as well. Me, I normally use the levels. Because sometimes the idea of graphing those values on a curved line on an X and Y axis confuses me. Some people that clicks and they're like, ooh, I get how that works, and they can do really cool, interesting things with it. Some people are like, I need it simple. I need one slider for how bright it is, and I need one slider for how contrasty it is. All three of those options are open to you. Brightness and contrast, levels, curves. All right, then the last thing we'll talk about is burning and dodging with these last few minutes we have. So over here, you should have, if yours isn't over here, it'll be somewhere. This is where I like to keep my tools, up here. And there should be one right here that looks kind of like that lollipop we were just talking about. When I hover over it, nope, sorry, that's the wrong one. Where's the, no, this one, sorry, that one. When I hover over it, it says the dodge and burn tool. That one right there, click on it. Oh, you may have, they may be grouped. I forgot I ungrouped my tools. All right, what would they have put that in with? Okay, all right. So then you're looking for this one, and when you hover over it, these other tools should be within it. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that I had done that. So again, another thing they did to try to make GIMP more like Photoshop is that they started grouping tools like Photoshop does, and that bugged the shit out of me because I have done this for so long and I'm old and set in my ways. So I ungrouped all my tools. I can show you how to do that later. What I might do is a video on things like that, should you want your tools to look like this. All right, we get this open. We got like 2 minutes left of class. Never mind. We'll talk about that burn and dodge tool another time. If you want to play around with it on your own, down here you grab a brush, get a certain kind of brush, make it a certain size. I made it too big. No, I didn't. Oh, it's because I've got the recording software going. Ugh, that's going to be a problem this semester. Down here you choose whether to dodge or burn. You can choose whether you're burning or dodging your shadows, midtones, or highlights. We'll look at this much more in depth when we actually have some photographs that we want to work on. All right, I'm just going to close this. Click to discard the changes because I'm not trying to save my photo that I was working on.